Welcome back everybody. Now on the back of the recent Bluetti AC200L video, I mentioned I've done a lot of research into these power stations and how they might compare to a full inbuilt battery system. And while people think that the cost is a huge factor, there's a number of other little levels that go into comparing each of these two different systems. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to combine all that together and show you what I've learned along the way in regards to the whole world of powering up your camper trailer, your ute canopy, or anything like that, whether or not it's a full built-in system or using the power stations, which are becoming really popular now. And I think many will be surprised that the gap isn't all that big, because now these power stations have got some really good 12-volt output. The pricing is really crisp when you compare all the components you need to put into a typical inbuilt 12-volt system, that the gap is getting quite small. Now there's pros and cons with each, which we'll go through in this video, but I think it's going to be a really interesting process to go through that's going to blow a few minds out there. Now all of this will make sense in a few minutes, so just bear with me. I just want to go through a few of the factors we need to consider as part of this video. It's not only cost, but we need to look at things such as capacity, your output, especially if you're looking to run an inverter and some 240 volt appliances, because you don't want to fit a battery that's not able to supply that inverter and run the systems that you want to do. And I will say at this point that some people mightn't want to run an inverter, so that will drop off and change the system that you're looking to do, and that will actually affect how you look at these power stations up against a traditional inbuilt battery system. And now we also need to consider size and weight. And as I went through the comparison, that became a really interesting thing, because I figured the power stations was actually way more, but if you lay all this out, they're actually very comparable. But you need to consider what all this consumes if you're looking to install it somewhere, as well as the weight. And that applies to both a power station and an inbuilt battery system. And noting we're in the winter months at the moment, efficiency is a really big thing as well. So your charges and how you input power into your battery system is a really big thing to consider, because as you draw that down, you need to make sure you can get that back in, particularly during the winter months when the sun isn't all that strong and you might be really struggling to keep up with the pace of your particular system. So all this needs to be considered when you're looking at a system. The other really big thing is scalability, and obviously that's where a fixed battery system has that opportunity, in that you don't need to buy it all in one go, but there's a few things to be considered there as well, which we'll cover as part of this video. And obviously fixed versus portability, because obviously there's a huge advantage with the power stations in that you can take them out, use them for a whole multitude of different things, whereas a fixed battery system is, as it suggests, fixed in the one spot that you put it in. We'll discover through this video that that's not necessarily a bad thing. People can work around that, and definitely the scalability comes into play, because you can actually slowly build up a fixed battery system, whereas your outlay into a power station is right up front. And I'm also going to add that it comes down to your skill levels and how you intend to use the system. If you're just coming into this nice and green, power stations might be really good because they just turn on and off, they're plug and play and they work extremely well. If you're like me and you like doing all that research and getting into the nuts and bolts, you're willing to have a go and you've got a fairly good idea of what you want to do, then obviously a fixed battery system comes into play as well. But there's a lot of parts that go into that, and it can become really confusing and overwhelming for someone that doesn't really know what they're getting themselves into. And again, that's where the power stations fill in a bit of a void in the market. And while some people think that cost is quite substantial in regards to fitting a fixed battery system versus these power stations, we're going to discover very soon that it's not really that big. So there's a few different avenues that people can go down with these electrical systems now, and I think it's really exciting, which is why I'm making this video. Now, I'll put it out there that I'm no expert in this. I've just done a lot of research and learned a lot along the way. And I think that will make it a nice, simple video for people to follow along and give some comparisons between these two different styles of products, especially given that most will be approaching this from a DIY point of view. And once you get into it, there's a lot to take in. So come along as we show you how. Now, I was going to kick this video off by running through in some detail the differences between these two units. So we've got the Jackery 2000 Pro here and the new Bluetti AC200L. Because in my opinion, these are a really good size unit, particularly if you're looking to use some 240 volt appliances for a weekend away or even some longer term traveling. But really they're essentially the same thing, except the Bluetti has a huge advantage over the Jackery, not only in regards to price, but also the DC output, which we discovered in that last video. So I'm going to discount the Jackery as part of this video, but I'm actually going to introduce another Bluetti product, which is the AC200 Max. Now I touched on that also in the last video by saying that I prefer this over the 200 Max. But once you start going into the cost comparisons, the AC200 Max comes out with a slight advantage because it doesn't need the D40 unit that pairs with this to provide that really good 12 volt output. So we're going to throw that into the mix, and I think it will be really, really interesting. So let me just shuffle this out of the way and we'll bring in the second component of this video comparison. And so you'll see here, I've had a little bit of an arts and crafts session. So obviously my budget is pretty tight and I can't just go out and buy all these components to do a physical comparison between the two. So what I've done is I've actually recreated the primary components of a fixed battery system using these cardboard boxes. And now, joking aside, if you're looking to plan something out, researching everything that I like to do, making these simple boxes just so you can spatially work out how things are going to work, the space they're going to consume is a really good idea. You don't need to put labels on them like this, but it's a really good way for exploring and understanding what you're working with. So what we've essentially got here is our lithium batteries. So it's a LiPo4 battery, which most of the lithium batteries are now, and you'll notice that that's quite a big piece. Now the other major components that go into a fixed battery system might be your 12 volt charging. So this is just a DC to DC charger. You might also have your 240 volt charger. You need to allow for that. I've got a little box here which is all your other little bits and pieces like bus bars, breakers and stuff like that. So that's just representative of the other little components you need to put in to link all these together. And then obviously if you're going down the route of wanting to run some 240 volt appliances, you need an inverter. So this pretty much makes up a fixed battery system that you would typically have in the back of your ute, in your caravan, your camp trailer or something like that. And as you can see, it does consume a fair bit of space because each of these items needs to have some ventilation around it as well. So it's not as simple as saying, well, look, I'm just going to pile all this in. You need to plan it out. But the beauty of having these is you can move them around, position them where they sort of work. So you've got your cable runs and everything. Have a look at a few diagrams and you can sort of work out how this may lie out. And I think particularly in the back of a ute, you'll see people have some really good examples on how they've set and laid all this out. So it's not consuming valuable storage space. Or in a camper trailer, or caravan or something like that, how it might sit under a bed, your lounge or something like that. Now there is another really big factor that's come into play over the last 18 months, and that's obviously the change in standard. I'm not going to go over that too much in this video, but that's something you need to be aware of. And there's a number of little things that trigger that. In particular, if you've got full AC input that is wired into the system, that obviously triggers that standard quite heavily. I've touched on that now. That is just something to educate yourself on and be aware. And obviously if you're paying someone to install a system, then that's a whole different kettle of fish because you've got to then pay their labour, their experience, their overheads, and all the extra materials and parts that go into that. We're really just looking at the components themselves, all the parts and bits and pieces that go in to lock all this into a system against the power station. If you start adding in labour, there's no comparison at all. The power station wins every day of the week. So as you'll see, it's going to get really, really interesting. So strap yourself in and let's get into the nuts and bolts. Now in this middle section, I'm actually going to detail and list out two different price point fixed battery installations and put them up against the power stations. And I think this will be really interesting. Now, if you haven't seen my videos before, I thought I'd take this opportunity to quickly say that this video will be broken into chapters. So you can skip forward and backwards to skip over bits and pieces if you don't want to watch it. In particular, the first is going to be an entry-level system, which is focused around the Kings components. So if you wanted to skip past that because you're like, Kings are rubbish, you can do that and skip on to our second system, which will be a Renogy system. But just let me step back a little bit and go through the method to the madness. So I've been through a lot of different brands and I want to just try to keep it all within one brand if I can for the two different systems. So there's sort of a little package. Yes, you can interchange a lot of components and mix and match brands with no dramas at all, but for the sake of this comparison, I just want to keep it all nice and tidy for both of the price point systems. So I've selected Kings because they've generally got most of the components we need to assemble a bit of an entry-level system that someone might be going into. And then from Renogy's point of view, they're actually a fairly reputable brand, they're very cohesive, and they've got a fairly good reputation as a mid-tier brand that matches in with these power stations, because beyond this, you start getting into some of the really expensive brands such as Enerdrive, Red Arc, Victron, all those sort of brands that sit at a much higher level, which even for me are way outside of my price point. And I think for the audience here, they're at the real professional people that have got really big setups, and I want to keep this as a more DIY, budget-friendly sort of channel. So even this, to me, is starting to get into the realms of an upper limit, but I think it's a really good exercise in detailing a mid-tier, affordable system on two different levels to see how we get to. So how I've approached this is that I've actually spec'd out a full system that is sort of equivalent to the power station. And what that allows us to do is have a level playing field. So I do actually run through in detail the what, the where, and the how on what a lot of these components are as we go through both of the fixed systems. So for anyone that's new or looking into this, it sort of gives an explanation of why you do a certain thing and how they fit into the ecosystem of the system you're trying to build. So I think that will be really interesting. At the same time, we're also listing the pricing, so there's a lot to go through and unravel as part of this section. Because I actually thought that, and I'll give a little teaser here, that the fixed systems would be way cheaper than a power station. But what I'm actually finding is that even with the mid-tier systems, they're essentially the same price, but you have to remember the scalability side of things here. So I'm doing a like for like. So if you're just wanting to set something up and grow it over a period of time, then obviously the initial investment is going to be a lot lower. So what we're going to do is head inside. I've had to set up a green screen because it's just too hard, because I've got a table that I'm running through, and it's going to be a little bit squishy because I've got a fair bit of information there, and I've had to cut a lot out because the video was getting way too long. So let's go in and start running through both of our fixed systems. We've got our AC200L here, and then I'm going to bring in the AC200 Max, because I think it's a bit of a pivotal power station that joins all of these systems together and creates a little bit of a point of difference even between the Bluetti products. So let's get into it. So starting with the King system, I've set up the table, which you'll see just here, and that lists out all the components that are part of that system. We'll use this same table for the Renogy system, and then I've got a slightly modified version because we'll then throw in the power stations and then compare them against the two systems we're going to quickly run through here. Now I'll include the pricing because that's a fairly important component, and I'll include both the recommended retail and the current discounted prices. Noting that generally we're always going to buy things when they're on special, and particularly with the King's products, you'd never buy them at the recommended retail price. They're always on special. But you'll notice the discount actually plays a very important part of this comparison, because it's that discount that closes the gap on a few of the different brands and makes a world of difference. But trust me, it will all make sense as we start listing all this out. And you'll also note that I've populated all the sizes and weights for all these components in the list as well. But we'll be here for days if we go through all of that. However, I have linked every single component into the YouTube description, which I typically do in all my videos. So you can go through and peruse at your own leisure and take as long as you want. So hopefully that will help anyone out that's watching this video and they need a little bit more detail on all the research I've gone into thus far. Now, one thing to note with the King's products is they generally just have the mandatory 12-month warranty on most of their products. The only difference here would be the batteries, where they get a 2-year warranty. However, as you know, with Kings, some people have issues with warranty, some people don't. It really is a bit of a mixed bag here. We use a lot of Kings products, and generally I've never really had an issue with them. For the price point, they work extremely well. And when it comes to things like the batteries, they're actually pretty solid. There's a few of the other components that you just need to be wary of, and I've generally picked the better ones so that we can generate this list also. And let's be honest, Kings are probably one of the most popular entry-level brands. So let's just see how much it would cost if we went down that route. And the first thing is obviously a lithium battery. So we're actually going to go a 200 amp hour LiFePO4 battery, which is a pretty standard fitment. To keep everything all level and fairly consistent through this review, I'm going the 200 amp hour in both the Kings and the Renogy system, just because that makes sense against the power stations we're putting them up against. They also have a 200 amp max discharge rate, And that's a really important thing when you start looking at inverters, but we'll cover that off once we get into the Renogy batteries, because there's a little bit of a difference there, and that's what swayed me towards a certain battery that I'm specifying in that particular comparison. Now these batteries retail for $899, but they're always on special. So the current discounted price is $669. Now obviously you're going to need a 12 volt charger as well. Now this is where things get a little bit interesting. Quite a few will recommend you go a separate DC to DC charger, which is really good for regulating the power that comes out of your towing vehicle or something like that. And then a separate MPPT charger, which is really good for regulating your solar input. Now, a lot of companies these days offer a combined charger. So we're going to opt in the 40 amp DC to DC charger, which has the integrated MPPT component to that. Now it retails for $399 and it's currently on special for $249, so let's just say 250 bucks. Now obviously a 240 volt inverter is an optional thing, but we're throwing it into this list so that we've got a level playing ground all the way through. Now Kings offer a 1500 watt or a 3000 watt inverter. I do think that 2000 watt is sort of the minimum size you want to be looking at. We're going to pile in the 3000 watt inverter because that just makes sense in this comparison. We're going to do the same with the Renogy system as well. Now the inverter itself, it retails for $399. It's on special currently for $300, so that's pretty good value really. Now the next component, which is also optional, is a 240 volt charger. Some people will run entirely off their 12 volt system, charging as they're running along, traveling and through solar panels, but I think it's a really good idea to have a 240 volt charger so that you can get that extra charge in if you've got some inclement weather, or when you're at home, you can plug it in and maintain your battery system. It's just a handy thing to have around. Now, surprisingly, Kings don't actually have a 240 volt charger, so I'm going to opt in the good quality Victron IP22, which is really, really popular, and it's a 12 volt 30 amp charger. Now it retails for $344, but you can often find it on special for just under $300. And now the next component on our list is a monitor and shunt. Now this is a fairly important component, and this is where the King system is very basic and analog in my opinion. So they've got a basic 500 amp shunt that connects to a really simple digital monitor. So it allows you to actually monitor the battery capacity and I think a little bit of what's going in and what's going out. But it's certainly not as detailed as what you get on the power stations and the Renogy interface that we're going to cover in the next comparison. But it does a job and it retails for $99. So you'll see pretty much for any 12 volt system, they'll recommend you put in a shunt. Usually it's a smart shunt that links into an app or something like that, so you can actually monitor and see what's going on a lot more effectively as opposed to just the simple little digital gauge that we've got as an option in this particular system. Now, over and above that, we could just chop this off, but for a fair comparison, I think you need to allow for all the other components, cabling and wiring that go into a proper 12 volt inbuilt system. So we've got one allowance here for components, and that includes all the buzz bars, circuit breakers, and all that sort of gear that you need to add in to connect all these components together. So I've put together what I think is a fairly light amount there of $150. It could even get a little bit more depending on the quality of the components you're putting in, but I think around $150 is a fair allowance. Now the next line under that is your cabling and terminals. Now, if you've done a few projects around and you've got some heavy gauge cable that you can use for this project, then obviously it's not going to be so expensive. But if you're starting from scratch and you need to go out and buy some heavy gauge cable, which you need to interconnect a lot of these components, the terminals that go with them, the crimpers and all that sort of gear, it can get quite expensive. Now obviously you can disperse that and use that on future projects and other 12 volt wiring you're doing within your project. But if we're just looking at having to buy in and get the components for the cabling and terminals, so I'm going to put $100 against that, and I think that's fair and potentially light, particularly if you've got to go out and buy all these materials in rolls along with the terminals and also some of the crimping tools and stuff like that. But remember, you can use them in all your other future projects. So $100 is what we'll apply here, and we'll roll that across to the Renogy system as well. Now, obviously you've got a fairly big battery that you need to tie down. I'm not going to get too into, as I said through the introduction, all the other regulations that go into these batteries these days. But as a bare minimum, you're going to need a battery tray, and I found this kick-ass one, which is really neat. It's cheap, it retails for $100, it's currently on special for $90. and that will serve the purpose perfectly. And again, I'll roll that through to the Renogy comparison just so we've got a clean and fairly level playing field. Now we get into the interesting bit, which is the totals. And you'll see here, as I reveal it, that the recommended retail price for the whole King system is around $2,500. So that is still quite a lot of money. Now, the good thing is it comes in at a discounted price of just under $2,000 at $1,940. So that's pretty good value because you're getting essentially $500 off that. And that's obviously where the King's marketing comes into play, but you really need to consider that against the reliability, the warranty, and everything against all the other products that we're going to showcase here, because it is obviously a lower quality product. Apart from the batteries, I'll say the batteries are actually pretty good, and it's got a much lower warranty for generally most of the components in this particular system. But it comes in at 35.7 kilos, which isn't too bad. It's a little bit more than our power stations, but that's to be noted because you've got all the different components, their enclosures, their casings, and all that sort of thing that goes into the weight for these particular units. And obviously we've got an extra 30 amp hour battery capacity, which will probably bump the weight up a little bit as well. So now let's go into the Renogy system and we'll see how that pans out, because it's a really good solid system and it's really interesting how it all works and compares against particularly the AC200L power stations, because it isn't too far off, which you'll see right now. So again, we're going to use a 200 amp hour battery, and I'm going to put the Pro battery in here. And the reason for that is it's a LiPo4 battery, like the same as everything else, but it's got a 200 amp max discharge rate as opposed to their standard battery that only has a 100 amp. And where this comes into play is when you're starting to connect up inverters. So if you're using a high wattage inverter, you want to have that high 200 amp discharge rate. So if you're connecting multiple appliances, you're not going to burn or stress out a battery that has that lower discharge rate. So if we just put the standard battery in here with a 100 amp max discharge, it'll probably work for most appliances. But if you're putting something really heavy in, such as a kettle, not that I'd recommend you use a kettle with an inverter because they're really heavy and suck all the juice out, but you want that higher 200 amp discharge rate to protect the battery and make sure you're not overloading it. And it's also got all the smarts in it, which is really important with this system that we're detailing here. And you'll see how it all works out because it all links together and it creates an interface which is very much like a power station. And that's something I like because you can monitor, you can control everything, and you've got everything at your fingertips either through the app or through the display screen, which is a real good quality interactive device, which we'll detail further in as we go down through the list. But this battery is a lot more expensive. It retails for $2,000 and it's currently on special for $1,300. You can get the basic battery for $100 less at the moment, but as I said, every day of the week I'd go this more advanced battery because of that 200 amp max discharge rate. And it comes in at 23 kilos, which interestingly is the same as the King's battery. It's just a more compact unit because they've worked a lot harder on the packaging of these particular batteries. Now for the 12 volt charger, and again, we've gone down a combined DC to DC and MPPT charger, except this one is a 50 amp, and this will make a fairly big difference when you see the comparison in the next table. And that brings it in a lot closer to the power stations as opposed to the smaller DC to DC chargers. It's all about getting that power in, and that's where the 50 amp makes a really big difference. Again, you pay for it because it retails for $960, but it's currently on special for $650, which softens the blow a little bit. It's a little bit heavier, being 1.9 kilos, but that's probably attributed to the slightly higher amperage of that particular charger as well. And then for the inverter, of course, we're going to go the 3000 watt inverter just to keep a level playing field. Now, it retails for $690, but it's currently on special for $460. If you're interested, the 2000 watt inverter, it's $100 less on special at around $360 currently as well. Now the 2000 watt inverter is just 40 millimeters shorter. All the other dimensions are the same. The 3000 watt inverter comes in at 6.4 kilos versus the 4.8 of the 2000 watt. It's an extra kilo or so heavier, but in the scheme of things, it just provides that extra functionality that you don't get with a smaller inverter. Now the 3000 watt inverter does have the added benefit of a UPS function. I don't think many people will use that when they're out and about, but that's a handy thing to have as well. Now, from a 240 volt charger point of view, Renogy doesn't really have a great 240 volt charger. Their charger, as you can see here, is only rated at 20 amps, which is quite small. So I would probably opt in a better quality charger, such as a Victron that we put in for the King's unit, or even the Kick-Ass chargers, because their new 240 volt chargers are quite good as well. You just want to find something that's got a decent amperage rating on it, again, so you can quickly charge up those batteries with no dramas at all. And now all these components from Renogy have been selected because they're smart, they're Bluetooth compatible, and they all link together. And that's where the monitor and shunt component comes into play, because they're all one core compatible. So you can actually then go and buy the one core display, which we've got just here, and it provides a ready reference inside your installation where you don't have to go to your phone app or anything like that and see everything that's going on, just like your power stations. So you can see everything going in, everything going out, you can control it, you can monitor all the settings, and it's a real handy visual thing to have in your installation where you don't have to go into your phone app or anything like that to monitor and see what's going on. So I've included that, even though it would be an optional extra, because you can actually Bluetooth all these components to your phone app. But I just think having that display is a really, really big thing. So the one core display, it retails for $310. It's currently on special for $290, so it's pretty good value. And it's only 27 millimeters high. So it's a real compact little thing you can discreetly place somewhere in your installation. And again, as I said, you can monitor everything that's going on. Now we'll just add in the $150 component for your buzz bars, your circuit breakers, all that sort of thing. All your cables and terminals, and obviously the Kick-Ass battery tray as well. And then we'll get into the components. And with the Renogy system, that's where it gets really, really interesting, because all of this retails for $4,630. Now that is a lot more than a typical power station, and in particular, these Bluetti products that we're putting this up against. Fortunately, when it's discounted, it comes in at $3,250, which is a lot easier to digest, because that is a substantial saving over the recommended retail price. And you'll see that when we get into the next comparison, that's what makes a really big difference and pulls it all in really close together when we're doing a full cost comparison. Now weight-wise, it comes in at the same 35.7 kilos as the King system. That's just a freak accident. I didn't plan that out at all, but it just shows that all these components generally all come in and weigh the same. And when you see the boxes that I've based off the Renogy system, they're generally all the same size. You're only talking like 20 or 30 mil here and there, but you do need to allow for all that when you're putting in a fixed system. So now let's bring in the final table, and that's where we'll introduce these power stations, and it will become really, really interesting as we go through a few of the different components and how I've listed it all out in here to properly compare it all together. So hopefully I can squeeze off to the side here, because this table's a little bit bigger, but it's a pretty important table, and this is where we sort of pull it all together. So we'll start off with the AC200L, and I'm going to combine that with the D40, because that's what you need to actually get your higher output 12 volt DC, which is what makes the comparison work between all these power stations and their equivalent fixed battery system. Before this, the real deficiency was a 12 volt output from the power stations. Even the Jackery, which is why I discounted it, it's only got that standard cigarette style lighter output if you're trying to add extra 12 volt functions into it. Yes, you've got all your USB charging ports, but actually extracting the 12 volt out of the power stations up until this point has been really, really hard. But Bluetti, with their additional 12 volt port, makes a world of difference, and we'll get onto that shortly. But that's what's really unlocked the ability for this comparison to occur. So let's get into the AC200L, and we'll run through all these components here and how all this is going to relate to the other systems. So straight off the bat, we've got a slightly smaller battery capacity at 170 amp hours. Now, that to me isn't a really big issue. It's pretty close to the 200 amp hour, but because these units charge so effectively, it means they can charge up a lot quicker than your typical fixed battery system. So to me, That's not a really big disadvantage, but something to be noted as we go through this. Now, just to keep things simple, in this table, I'm just going to list the size of the AC200L power station itself. The D40 charger, it's about the same size as a typical DC to DC charger. So these power stations are actually quite compact, and you'll see that when we compare it against the cardboard boxes I've made up. And I was actually quite surprised by that, but it kind of makes sense because they're all packaged as one real compact and efficient unit. Now, when it comes to weight, I'll actually bring the D40 in here because I think that's fairly important. So the AC200L, it weighs 28.3 kilos and the D40 is 2 kilos. So combined, they both weigh 30.3 kilos. Now, this is the interesting thing, and I will split out the solar or the 12 volt input from the combined input, but this is where these power stations really stand out from a fixed battery system, because this AC200L, even without the D40, can take in a total of 2400 watts. That's charging from both AC and solar, and it can do it concurrently with no dramas at all, which I guess your fixed battery systems can, but they're not really geared up for that. So you would have your DC to DC feeding in and then a separate AC charger, and it's not really going to talk between those two units in a typical situation. Potentially with the one core monitoring, the Renogy system, it's got a little bit of smarts there, but these power stations are really, really efficient and intelligent in how they draw this power in and charge the batteries up nice, safely and effectively, and really, really, really quickly. And that's where the real advantage comes in and makes them quite competitive against a fixed battery system. And that's something you'd really need to look at. Again, particularly in these winter months when it's really hard to get the charge in, you want to make it as effective and efficient as possible. Now, from a monitoring point of view, these are excellent because everything's built in, it all links and talks to each other through that one interface, which is fantastic. And again, the Renogy starts building on that and is very, very similar. These power stations are fully expandable, and it is incredible when you jump on some of these Facebook groups on all the different brands, but particularly Bluetti, what people use these for. And a lot of them have expansion packs on them because they're using these power stations to run their home office when they're at home. They run their full PC gaming setup. It is really, really amazing. And obviously over in the States, they've got a lot of real heavy, big storms, and they've got them set up so that they can run everything in their house when they've got a power outage and stuff like that, or at least the critical appliances. And that's where you can really justify the price of these units, even though you'll see that there's not really that much difference, by being able to use them for a whole heap of other functions. Particularly for emergencies and stuff like that. If your battery's stuck in your caravan or camper trailer in the back of your ute, you might be able to get it close and plug in a fridge and stuff like that, but generally you're not going to drag them inside and run things in the case of an emergency. The last little component I've got here, which of course the power stations do, is remote operation and monitoring. And again, some people won't need that, but I think it's a real handy thing to have. So you can see what's going on. You can instantly go in, change your setup if you need to, monitor, control, and remotely turn things on and off. Because as you saw with our camper trailer project that's coming up, I'm going to have this AC200 mounted on the opposite side of our slide out kitchen, and I'll be able to remotely turn particularly the 240 volt power on and off. So I only have it on and I'm using it when I've got appliances connected in. To me, that's a handy little thing to have, and it's something that just makes life a little bit easier. And so Bluetti have a recommended retail of the AC200L and D40 combined of $3,338. It's currently discounted by only $200, unfortunately, at the moment. So that brings it down to roughly $3,140. But when I was looking at this last month, when I did the original AC200L and D40 review, it was discounted by $400, which actually offsetted the price of the D40 unit. The D40 actually retails for around $339, but it is still actually less than the Renogy system. So it's still competitive, even though it's not heavily discounted. So to me, that's a pretty interesting comparison. So now I'm going to quickly jump out of this green screen I've got set up here, and I want to touch on the AC200 Max. So here's our AC200L, and if we can use the movie magic, here's the Bluetti AC200 Max. And if we superimpose this here, you can see it's pretty much exactly the same size as the AC200L. In fact, it shares a lot of the specs in a way. On paper, the specs are all pretty much the same. However, the big thing with the Bluetti units is this second DC port. So you've got the cigarette style DC port that most power stations and electrical systems have. You've got all your USB outlets here. You've got GPIOs on the side here. And we've got the 170 amp hour battery capacity within this unit. And on this 200L, we've got this cable that comes out of this secondary port that runs through to the D40 that we detailed in the last video. Now, what this does is it actually outputs 48 volts from this port, and the D40 converts that down to 12 volt. Now, through a lot of us actually using these and doing a little bit of experimentation, we pretty much realized that this will only output 12 volt at 20 amp max output. And that doesn't matter if it's got the Blue Yeti going into it, solar as well. It'll actually favor solar over the power station. So if the two are interconnected and the solar input is more than the power station, it'll disconnect that and just output the solar output, which is really, really good. But that's not really what we're talking about here. It's the fact that we've got this D40 unit that you need to buy separately, and it plugs into this secondary port. Now, if I just pull this out and pretend this is the 200 max, because they're essentially the same to look at, this secondary DC port here is a 12 volt 30 amp rated port. So natively coming out of the unit, this port here on the AC200 max outputs 12 volts at 30 amps, which is a lot different to the AC200L that outputs this at 48 volts and I think around 8 amps or something like that. So the advantage in a way of the 200 max over the newer 200L that you see here is that you don't need to buy this additional D40 DC to DC charger so that it can actually wind down and convert the 48 volt into the 12 volt on this. That becomes a fairly big factor because the price point, which we'll see of the AC200 max, has been discounted greatly. The disadvantage of the AC200 max over this, which we'll also see, is a charging input because the AC200 max is an older unit and the smarts inside it aren't quite as efficient as this new generation of power station. And in a way, it's a lot simpler because the output from this secondary port is 12 volt, 30 amp. You don't need to convert it. You don't need to do anything with it. It's there for you to use, and you can simply take this output and put it into something like a control panel and then disperse all your power from there. So it's definitely something to think about, but let's get back into it. So anyway, that's why it's in this comparison, and it's actually going to make quite a dynamic difference because I'm put the AC200 max head to head with the King's system, and then the AC200L will go head to head with the Renogy system. And that actually gives two very different systems on different budget points, which I think will actually help a lot of people out there. And it just shows if you shop around and just go through all the specs and find a system that works for you, you can actually get a fairly good bargain, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a fixed in place system. So anyway, let's go through the 200 max. We'll see how it sits in the scheme of things. So obviously the 200 max has the same 170 amp hour battery capacity, which again is a little bit under the 200 amp hour of the two next systems we're going to add to the list. Size-wise, it's pretty much the same as the AC200L. Weight-wise, it's obviously a little bit lighter than the AC200L and D40 combined, being 28.1 kilos. But obviously the compromise here is the AC and solar input is reduced at 1400 watts versus the 2400 watts of the newer system. And that's where the price point makes a really big difference because this brings it down into that lower price point, particularly when it's on sale at the moment. And in the scheme of things, it's still very competitive with the other two systems that are going to be added to the mix very, very shortly. So I think the AC200 Max is definitely worth considering. And given you don't have the complication of the D40, I don't know, which way would I go? I really don't know because it still has a fairly efficient charging profile. It is a lot less on paper than the AC200L, but I do wonder if you'd really notice it in the real world if you didn't have the two units side by side. I think the AC200 Max will still charge really, really efficiently. Now, obviously, it's still got that same battery monitoring system, so it's really efficient from that point of view. It's expandable, and it's got that remote control and monitoring ability through your apps and all that sort of thing that the King system we're going to put in right now doesn't have. Now the AC200 Max, it retails for $2,999, but it's currently discounted by $800 at the moment. So that brings it down to just under $2,200, which isn't really that far off the King system we're about to add in here. So let's put that in and we'll run through all the little differences and similarities and see how that sits. So the King system obviously has that 200 amp hour battery capacity. The total system weighs 35.7 kilos, which is roughly 7 kilos heavier than the AC200 Max. So that's interesting to note as well. Now where the King system really starts falling down is it's got a maximum input from its DC to DC charger of only 500 watts. Now the AC200 Max, it's got a maximum solar input of 900 watts. So that's almost double the King's unit, which means it's going to charge twice as fast straight off 12 volt or solar. So again, that's where these power stations really come in. If you want to compare that to the AC200L, it's got a maximum solar input of 1200 watts, which means they're incredibly fast at charging. But it's just one of those things you need to consider and put one against the other to work out what works best for you. But that's one huge advantage of the power stations over the fixed battery units. Now I didn't cover this off in the AC200 Max, but it's got a 2200 watt inverter versus King's 3000 watt inverter. And that's just how all the packaging systems work. You could obviously go a 1500 watt inverter if you want. That's going to bring the price down a little bit, but it's all like for like as you go into this. And now you'll start seeing a few red crosses coming in, and that's where I've sort of used the little graphics on the bottom end of this table to highlight a few things. So obviously from a monitoring point of view, none of these King's components really connect and talk to each other. King's do actually have a remote of sorts for their inverter, and then you do have the monitor via the 500 amp shunt, but you're not really seeing a cohesive system that you can monitor there. So it gets a little cross from that point of view. It's fully expandable. You can add additional batteries onto the King's battery units without too much drama at all. You just got to wire them in series or parallel, whatever you're doing there. So that's a tick there. And obviously from the remote control point of view, it really doesn't have anything. It's a very simple, basic system that doesn't have the interface of everything else that we're looking at here. So now let's plug in the Renogy system because it's got those interfaces. And I want to see how it all compares and pans out, particularly against the AC200L. So again, the Renogy's a 200 amp hour LiFePO4 battery. It weighs in the same 35.7 kilos. And now we get into a few of the differences with the units. Now it's got a better DC to DC charger, being a 50 amp unit. So it has a total input of 700 watts. So again, if you compare that to the AC200 Max, I would say it's fairly comparable. It's close. But against the 200L, it's still quite significantly under. I mean, it's close to half again of the 200 watt max that the AC200L has. It's obviously got the 3000 watt inverter, and as I said, with the one core display, it's a full monitored system. You can see everything that's going in and out, pretty much the same as a power station with no dramas at all. It's fully expandable, you can add extra batteries into it. And from a remote operation point of view, I would say, look, I've gave it an orange tick because I wasn't quite sure of a few of the units there, but I would have thought through the app, it's probably not too bad. I don't think the Renogy system will be as fully integrated as a power station, but it's going to be pretty close and it's going to be fairly effective. Fortunately, it's discounted. It comes in at $3,250, which is only just above the AC200L and D40 combined. So that I found really, really interesting because they're very comparable. They're similar spec systems. One's fixed, one's portable, and they're pretty much exactly the same price. So it shows the gap isn't really all that big. And I knew I was close, but I didn't know I was really that close in the comparisons I'd made just on paper in looking at various bits and bobs. And I haven't picked the Renogy because it's close. That's just how it all panned out. I picked the Renogy because it's a fairly cohesive system and it all links together. And it's a reputable brand that most people know. And if you go through a lot of the Facebook groups, particularly the 12 volt groups, they're very reliable and they've got a fairly solid reputation. So that's why I've added the Renogy system in. I think Kick-Ass is pretty much on par with them. I guess from a service point of view, you might get slightly better service because of their Aussie presence. They're an Australian company. They're developing products for the Australian market, and they really do back up their systems, products and everything from their Queensland-based operations. But you do pay for that. And that's the problem with the Australian products versus these imported products, which essentially the rest of the systems are. Now, I want to expose one line under here, which I think is really, really interesting. So let me just highlight that, and I'll shift off to the side in case I'm blocking out the main bit here. But that is the discount that's been applied through all of these systems in the pricing that I looked at to generate this particular video. And it really is quite interesting. So the poor old AC200L, it's got to deal with a minimal $200 discount in all of this to get it to compete with these other systems. The AC200 Max at least has an $800 discount, which is pretty substantial. I expect that that's going to dwindle and sort of decrease over the next few months because all the hot sales are on at the moment with the end of financial year, Prime Day and all that sort of thing. But definitely look around because all these units go up and down. Now the Kings obviously have a heavily discounted price because that's how their marketing works. And it's been knocked down by around about $550. So the $800 discount on the 200 Max means that it does actually compete with the Kings unit because it's got a heavier discount than what Kings are currently offering, which is pretty incredible in itself. The big thing that blew me away was the Renogy system. I thought it would actually come in a little bit lower, to be honest. I did expect the fixed systems to be cheaper. I mean, that's naturally what you expect, but it had to be discounted by around $1,380. So like $1,400 worth of discounts to get it to compete with the power stations. And a lot of the other brands I looked at, I mean, they need similar discounts as well. It really was quite incredible. But the difference here would be that if you were just looking to install a simple fixed battery system, you didn't have like a $1,000 inverter in there, obviously it's going to probably be a lot more competitive and cheaper than a power station, but it's not going to offer all the functionality of these power stations either. So it's just working out what works best for you. And that is essentially the end of the black screen. So I hope you enjoyed that, but I think it just gives hopefully a nice simple visual comparison on how all these compare with each other, pan out, and how it all works. So if you've made it this far, I hope this is really helping you out and you're learning a lot from this episode because as I said before, there's a lot to go through and it's been a lot to actually collate and put together. There's so much information there and I've had to condense it down and edit out a lot of stuff as well. So let's now go through some of the functionality aspects, the pros and cons, now that we know how the pricing structure all works and that really these two systems aren't too far apart. So from a pros and cons point of view, obviously the first thing is that portability function because the power stations are just so portable and particularly with us here where we've got a caravan, 2 campers now, a ute, stuff like that, I just pick it up and take it and use it in multiple different vehicles. So there's that flexibility that is offered by the power stations that the fixed battery systems simply can't do. Now I'll add one more thing with the power stations while we're talking about them, in that you don't need to worry about the cables so much because they're easy to connect, disconnect, and you don't have that real, I would say, electrical sort of thing that you need to deal with when you're building a battery system. So that's a real advantage to the power stations as well. Now there's a bit of negative that goes with that because they have so many proprietary cables that it does become a little bit difficult and it's more to do with the solar side of it. So I've got a lot of different adapters now because I've been working with so many different power stations that I find, you know, they're always swapping and changing things around. And the one big factor there is obviously we're dealing with a lot of power stations that are coming, particularly from the US, Europe, different markets where they've got different style connectors. So we're finding they're actually creeping their way into Australia where previously we primarily dealt with the Anderson plugs and stuff like that. The MC4 is becoming really, really popular. And then you've got the XT60s and XT90s. And the other DC style connections that you get with these power stations. You might just have to buy an adapter cable to plug your Anderson style solar panels into the power station itself. But it's really easy to do and there's no dramas there. So that would be one negative against the power stations in that they do have a lot of proprietary connectors. And I have found with the larger Bluetti units, it's another level up again where the plugs that actually go into the unit itself, which is an advantage, they actually screw in, they're really specialised to these Bluetti power stations themselves. Having those real positive connections that can't be pulled out is a really good thing for the Bluetti power stations. It's just another proprietary thing that you need to consider. If you lose a cable on the run, while you're traveling around, you can't easily replace it. So again, that's another disadvantage that you need to think about with the portability side of these power stations, because you need to be organised. You've got to put everything back in a bag, because if you misplace it, it might be really hard to get this set up, and in particular charging when you get to your Nest site if you haven't got the cables that you need. That's just one thing to consider, and just a tiny little dot point that I put against the power stations. Now, as I've said a number of times through, the fixed battery systems are scalable, so you're not having to invest all up front. And I just want to add one little thing there that I sort of had to edit out or skipped over through the front portion of the video. And that is when you're selecting a battery, and that's why that 200 amp maximum discharge rate becomes really important, is that you want to select a battery that's going to future-proof you for anything you might add on. So you might be out of space at the moment where, I might just put in a 100 amp hour battery. It will run my fridge, charge up a few things, but you don't know what's going to change down the track. So for me, I'd always want to future-proof and over-specify. So I would probably go a 200 amp hour battery, and I'd want something with that larger discharge rate so I can add an inverter down the track, and I don't have any of those complications, overheating issues, and disconnection issues if I'm trying to run some 240 volt appliances, which is what I've upgraded to down the track. The worst thing you want to do is have to upgrade all your batteries because you've underspec them because of your budgetary constraints normally when you're actually first going out and purchasing a system. And again, that's where these power stations are good, because they're already geared up for that. You can run them really low just using the USB outlets and the cigarette style plug. You can plug a few appliances in. You don't even have to plug appliances in. You can still run your fridge, charge your appliances off the power station, but it's already geared and set up to do pretty much anything you want it to do, depending on the size that you do. And obviously with the power stations, you don't have to get a big unit like this. You can go the next level down, for example. So you got the AC180, you got the Ecoflow Deltas that sit in that sort of middle ground where you can still run a camp fridge, all your camp lighting and all that sort of gear. They're just around half the capacity of these. So you just have to be a little bit more careful with your usage and how you can charge that back up while you're on the run. And that takes me on to one of the other pros and cons that you need to consider, and that is warranty. I've touched on this a little bit, and that was why I was a little bit hesitant in putting the King system in, because I know while a lot of people will refer back to that as being, I can get a King system for half the price, we saw that probably wasn't necessarily the case. But you also need to consider the reliability of the equipment that you're purchasing and using, particularly if you're out and about and you're traveling remotely. That does take me into warranty, and even with the Bluetti products, it's a little bit inconsistent as you go through. So the AC200L here, it's got a full 5-year warranty. The 200 Max, it's only got 48 months, so 4 years. And then when you go into the Renogy system, even its components all vary as you go through. But the one huge thing that I forgot to mention in those tables is that the 200 amp hour Pro Series Renogy battery has a 7-year warranty. That is a huge advantage for the Renogy batteries over a lot of the other similar price batteries in its price point. So that is another thing to consider. You've got to go through the specs for all the different components you're looking at and look at the warranty, go into a number of Facebook groups to see what people say. Now, the Facebook groups are really, really hard because you'll have people that are biased towards certain brands, and you'll have people that rubbish other brands even though they haven't used them as well, just due to hearsay that they've heard on the internet and other Facebook groups and stuff like that. So you need to filter it all out. But you'll start seeing a bit of a theme with certain brands, and then you'll know if you're comfortable with that or not. And another little point to note, which sort of ties in the scalability and warranty reliability side of things, is what happens if something goes wrong with one of these components. Well, with the built-in battery system, it's probably not so bad. So say if your charger failed or something like that, well, you've still got the rest of the system that you can use while you're out and about without too many dramas at all. Now, obviously, if something happened to the power station, then you're going to lose the functionality of that certain element from the power station, but generally it should keep on running. If you need to send it back for warranty work, for example, then obviously you've lost your whole power stations. But I will raise one important thing. The good thing about the power stations is if something was to go wrong, then from a warranty point of view, there's no grey area. If something's failed inside this unit, then it's going to be covered. If you're interconnecting all different products together, particularly if they're different brands, then you're introducing that grey area where if one of the components dies, The company that supplies that could come in and say, well, that's due to how you've connected up, or there's user error, or it's something to do with another product that's interconnecting with it. So there's no grey area with the power station. You do have a slight grey area with a built-in fixed battery system and all the little components that come in together, unless you're paying someone to install the system. I've got two other factors I want to go through before we wind all this up. And it's more to do with the fixed battery system and things you need to consider there, and that's why I've made these little boxes up. Now, we've touched on this already, and the first factor is obviously the size and the space that a fixed battery system takes up. It's a lot more than a portable power station. Let me just put that out there. A lot of people think that the fixed battery system is the way to go, but you need to consider that all of this consumes space, and as I said way back in the beginning, they all have ventilation requirements around it. So you really need to consider the space that all this takes. Now, the one advantage with a fixed battery system is that, say with this inverter, and you're in a ute canopy or something like that, you can mount this above, which you can also do with your chargers and everything like that. So I do say it's a bit of a negative or something you need to consider, but you can actually vertically stack a fixed battery system, which you obviously can't do with a portable power station, but is packaged so tight that it generally works. The other thing to note is you need to typically keep the front area of a power station clear so you can plug everything in. And unless you're doing something like us, where we've got the D40 that sits off to the side and we can remotely plug in all our 12-volt appliances, run some leads out for our 240-volt appliances, you're typically restricted to being able to plug things in wherever this power station is. Now, obviously you can move that around, but if you've got something like a camp trailer where you're trying to build it in, that's just a factor you need to consider over, say, a fixed battery system where you'll have a control panel mounted off to the side somewhere, and it's really the same thing. You'll plug all your bits and pieces into wherever that control panel is, but it means you can mount this battery further away and it's not necessarily in the space where you're working, so you can minimize the impact. So that's just another consideration to note there. And so that's where I'm going to end things. The one thing I haven't done through this video that people might have expected is to talk about solar. And I haven't gone into the input or the output side of it. I'm just been talking about what sits in the middle, which is the power station or the fixed battery system. And I think if you made it this far, you're actually being quite interested as well. And I hope this has been a really good comparison for you. Now, obviously I based it on the Bluetti product because, as I said, they've got that really good 12-volt DC output. Even though the AC200L is slightly compromised by the D40, it's still a really good solution, which is why I'm going to use this in our camper trailer. If this was a Renogy system sitting here, which it is kind of based on, but it's got my generic sort of labels on it, it would interface pretty much the same as these power stations, which is something you wouldn't have got, say, 5 or 10 years ago. It would be just real analog, plug in, switch on, switch off, and you couldn't really tell what was going on unless you had a little meter in or something like that. You certainly couldn't set up and change things on the fly like you can do with the mid-tier and upper tier systems that you've got these days. So I just thought this would be a really good comparison. Yes, it's been a little bit long, but I'm not quite ready to release a few videos. So there's going to be a lot of videos coming out shortly once I get the time to actually go through and edit them and finish off the relevant projects that they're related to. So again, if you made it this far, I thank you for watching. And as I always say, get out there, stay safe, have fun, and we'll catch you next time.